Hello, everyone. You will see a poll put up on the screen. If you can fill it out, that'd be great. It's just asking if you joined us before. If you would like, you could also drop into the chat where you're calling in from today. While we wait, I'd also like to introduce myself. My name is Madison Burnett. I'm a BCBA and I lead our professional development program, and I'll be supporting through the webinar today. In addition to that role, I work alongside other BCBAs on our clinician-led recruitment team, and I support in the effort of recruiting quality professionals to join our team. If you are interested in joining MPG, please indicate so in the post-webinar survey at the end of this webinar, or you can email careers@manhattanpsychologygroup.com. All right, and now I'd like to tell you a little bit about Manhattan Psychology Group. We were established in 2011, and we've continued to grow our team consisting of skilled adult and child psychologists, neuropsychologists, behavior analysts, special educators, licensed social workers, and behavior interventionists. As a team, we're committed to wraparound care, which includes our wide range of services from mental health and testing to ABA and educational services. This holistic approach allows us to address various needs and challenges with compassion and care, and we provide services to clients out of our Upper West Side and Long Island City offices, in home, school, and clinic-based settings, as well as through telehealth. Our team is committed to serving individuals, couples, and families of all ages in diverse settings. We're also pleased to offer these free monthly webinars to parents and professionals where we will continue to learn and foster meaningful connections. Our vision at MPG is to create a future where individuals and their families feel supported, connected, and empowered. And our mission is to provide multidisciplinary, integrative support for individuals and their families who experience mental health, behavioral, and educational challenges. In an effort to stand by that mission and vision, we are thrilled to offer free 20-minute phone consultations with our clinical team. You can schedule time by visiting our website at www.manhattanpsychologygroup.com, or you can follow the link that I'll be putting in the chat momentarily. All right, now for some housekeeping information. We'll be leaving the chat open, but please post any questions you have in the Q&A so we can make sure that they are seen. If there's time at the end of this presentation, Aiden and Ayal will answer some of these questions. And now I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Dr. Aiden Schmidt treats children, adolescents, and adults with a variety of presenting concerns, including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, obsessive-compulsive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and other behavioral difficulties. She utilizes evidence-based psychotherapy such as cognitive behavioral therapy, parent management training, interpersonal therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as dialectical behavioral therapy. Dr. Schmidt prioritizes collaborative, strengths-based approach and tailors care to the needs of each individual family. She specializes in treating and researching internalized disorders such as anxiety and depression. Additionally, she conducts research on social media use and emotion regulation in adolescents. And Dr. A.L. Goldberg is a licensed clinical psychologist in New York. He specializes in helping children, adolescents, and families who have experienced trauma or are facing disruptive behavior challenges. He values working closely with families and caregivers to support their youth in managing emotions and behaviors effectively. He is particularly passionate about helping families navigate technology and media, offering strategies to establish healthy screen time habits and promote social emotional development. While employing evidence-based treatment modalities, Dr. Goldberg tailors his approach to fit unique circumstances of each individual family. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ayala and Aiden.
Great. Thank you so much, Madison, for that great introduction. So thank you everyone for joining. It's so great to see everyone here on this cold February day. If people could put in the chat whether they're a parent or a clinician or provider, that would be really helpful, just so we can kind of get a sense of who we have all here today. You could just say parent or provider or both, which is also great. And, social media is something that's in the news, in policy, in our homes. So it's really great to kind of have this space and talk to you guys about this today. Next. Next. Thanks. So just to overview the agenda, we're going to start talking about adolescent development and teenagers and why it's such a unique time. I know some of you may have been at our webinar last week that was kind of focusing on younger children. So this is particularly focusing on the adolescent teenage period. then talking about what social media looks like in teens, then moving on to what you're all probably here for, those parenting and provider strategies that are really going to help empower our teenagers for digital thriving, and then ending up with some Q&A. Next. Okay, so we got a lot of parents, providers, both. Awesome. So we have a good kind of mix. Thank you guys. And next. So we're going to talk about what makes the teen years so unique. I wrote my thesis, my dissertation on adolescent development. I just think it's such a special period. And those of us who work with teens or have teens as children know that it's kind of a blessing and a curse sometimes. And a lot of people think of, when they think of psychology, development, brain development, they really think of 0 to 5, babies and toddlers. But a lot of people may not know that there's a huge burst of brain development in adolescence too. So kind of that second decade of life, 10 to 20, give or take. And so what makes it so special? We can go to the next slide. During adolescence, there are lots of biological, psychological, and social changes that occur. And we want to keep this in mind when we're talking about social media and parenting strategies for this age range. Social and emotional stimuli become a lot more salient. So if you can even remember your adolescence and teen years, you probably have really vivid memories from that period. And even thinking about, oh, I remember, that one pizza party or that one look someone gave me. That's actually the brain saying to you, like, social stuff is really important during this time. And again, with the second point too, peers are kind of increasing in priority compared to parents. So as a young child, mom and dad are the best thing, but as they get older, kids are wanting to spend more time with their friends, prioritize that, not really listen to mom and dad anymore, right? So we can kind of view it as switching in priority. Third, it's that period of life where kids are really trying to figure out who they are, who they want to be. Again, moving further away from parents and building their own autonomy and independence, getting their first job, commuting to school, driving, all of those things, and really figuring out who their friends are, what their interests are, what their hobbies are. So that's really key as well. And then the next point, the onset of a lot of mental health symptoms. Unfortunately, for better, for worse, during this time, partially because of all these changes, we are going to see some of those mental health symptoms coming up, especially anxiety, depression symptoms, maybe even self-harm and suicidality in some kids. And so we see those coming up, and that's why this is also a really important time to target. And for that last part, there's increases in neuroplasticity, which basically means our brain's ability to learn things and change. So while it is a stressful time on the one hand, it's also, one psychologist called it the age of opportunity, because compared to the whole lifespan, this time period is when our brain is really open to change. That's why if you teach a teenager something, they're probably going to remember it for the rest of their lives, right? And they're going to use all those things they learned in their teenage years to set up for adulthood. So, yep, the babies and the toddlers, we want to teach them a lot too, but adolescence is actually the second period in life where we can really make a difference and really make changes. So it's kind of a both and. It's hard, but and we have an opportunity here to intervene. And next slide. One more kind of a nerdy take here, just looking at the brain changes. I think this is really important to know. Like I said, social emotional stimuli is really important in adolescence. So we can see in the middle of this graph here, there's this gap though. So that social emotional stimuli, that's the red line on top, really important. If we think about cavemen and evolution, it's because that's the time where people would need to find mates, right? And procreate. And so that's why the brain is like social, social, social. But, and rewards and risky behaviors, right? We want all those things. But the cognitive control, that's like our animal brain. The cognitive control, which is the front of the brain here, our prefrontal cortex, that's kind of lagging behind, right? You've heard of that statistic, like the brain doesn't fully develop until 25. That's more so what we're talking about. So that ability to make decisions, to plan, to weigh pros and cons, there's this gap. So one psychologist said, adolescence is like a lot of gas, not a lot of brakes. Okay. So that's literally how their brain works. And so it's not that they don't know that there are risks, it's just that they're kind of more motivated to get the rewards. Of course, we see this evening out by the 20s and 30s, but this is the time where they're going to be interested in all of those things. So super cool stuff. And that's why we're going to kind of intervene during this time. Ayal, you can take over. Thanks.
Great. So quickly, we're going to talk about what social media use looks like in today's teens. We're going to go through a little bit of data and just also some understanding of kind of what the field looks like, so to speak. So starting out, just a little bit of a glossary of some of the big social media platforms. Just really quick, one of the things that we encourage parents and clinicians to know really well is the different platforms that kids and teens are using. Know the differences between them, right? For example, what the differences are between Snapchat and Instagram. Snapchat's unique thing, for those that don't know, is that the messages can disappear. They don't always, and they don't disappear completely, but that's a whole different rabbit hole. But we really want to be familiar with what teens are using because that's going to inform how to manage their use and how to really understand their use from their perspective and from a parent's perspective, which we'll get into in a second. Some other big ones, just to put them out there, are Roblox. Twitch is one that's really, really big with teens, especially teen boys who really like watching gamers do their thing online. That's a really big live streaming platform. So just knowing the different ones and knowing what your kid is using is really, really crucial. So some statistics here. This is from Pew research data about teens, specifically US teens ages 13 to 17. And really just highlighting here how constant and how comprehensive teen social media use is. You can see YouTube and TikTok is really, really high in terms of their use, and the share of teens using them daily, including almost constantly, is pretty significant. We can see here that those who use YouTube daily is 71%, TikTok daily is 58, Snapchat 51. And again, this is still, this is one of those fields where really, really recent data is key. And we don't have incredibly recent data here. This is now from 2 years ago, but it's still really important to note that these are very popular platforms that teens are using very, very frequently. And just to highlight that, the number of teens that say they're online almost constantly is up from 24% almost a decade ago, and it's now about double. It's now closer to 46%. And that seems to have leveled off a little bit. But there is also other use that's increasing, and you can see that portion of teens who are using several or once a day is also increasing. And so the overall share is really just kind of the highlight here, that media use is increasing as time goes on. So what are some of the risks of social media use to teens? I think we have a poll for this one that's going to pop up that you should be able to respond into. There should be a little button that you have to click OK, and then the poll will come up. But there's a few different ways to do it. Whatever pops up on your screen, you can follow those instructions. And we want to just hear from you. What are some of the risks that you are identifying about social media use, specifically for this teen population? And then we'll go through some of those responses.
Yes, please don't be shy. We want to be most helpful to you guys. So it would be great to know your experiences. And this could also be risks you've heard of in the media, or risks you've experienced at the dinner table, right? So it can be both and.
Yeah, and one of the things we're going to do is show you some data about what surveys of parents show us about what they're, as a whole, worried about in terms of social media and teens. So we'll get to some of those responses.
We have several responses in the word cloud so far. So leading right now is social isolation. There's tired, scrolling, mature, social comparisons, low self-esteem, sleep issues, bullying.
Yeah, so it sounds like so far a lot of cognitive concerns in terms of different ways that teens may be thinking or processes that might be happening in their brains as a result. A lot of different concerns about mood and emotional health. So, we heard a little bit about sleep, a little bit about depression in there. Some really big worries for sure.
Yeah, we have leading right now is low self-esteem, social isolation, and bullying.
Yeah, very, very common ones that we'll get to in a second, and show you some data to support that you're not the only ones concerned. Um, Next, we're going to ask the same question, but just about some of the benefits. And this is something we want to kind of do throughout the presentation, is remind that, while we want to manage the risks, there are also benefits, and those are some of the reasons that this use is so popular. So we'll get to some of those as well, but feel free to be just as honest in the chat, again, about those benefits. And, sometimes, these are weighty questions, but we don't want to say that the benefits outweigh the risks. We don't want to say that the risks outweigh the benefits. We want to be talking about all of them really comprehensively in a detailed way. So we want to hear from you. What are some of those benefits that you either know of or identify with?
Most commonly, I'm seeing connections. They're learning, educational, entertainment, social support, connecting to peers, education, social awareness.
Yeah, so really, really a lot of responses around those different social domains, making connection with peers. Social support is a really big one, and that's frequently identified in research as a protective factor related to mental health, and a lot of other areas of life. So definitely one of the big benefits that we hope to gain from social media. Yeah. All right. So moving on, we want to talk a little bit about those parent perspectives. Like I said, you can see here that that same kind of data set of ages 13 to 17, the parents of those teens were most worried about explicit content. And then the next concerns were wasting too much time, being distracted, especially from homework, sharing too much and just kind of being too personal online, feeling pressured to act a certain way, harassment or bullying, which I know was mentioned, is also up there. And then those mood concerns, anxiety, depression, lower self-esteem as well. So a lot of these concerns are really common, and you're not the only ones flagging these for sure. One of the things I want you to do is kind of remember the parent perspective here, because we're going to shift to the teen perspective, and talk a little bit about some of those differences quickly. So some data here, about 4 in 10 parents and teens, so both, say that the time teens spend on their phone regularly leads to arguments. So this is something that we're seeing a lot, is conflict around media use, and this is becoming more and more common. We see it all the time in our clinical work as a concern. Kids are really frustrated with the parents, parents are frustrated with the kid, and there's a lot of different conflicts about how to manage that use, what the guidelines should be, whether there should be exceptions in one given scenario, and those kinds of debates. And about 4 in 10 teens say that they spend too much time on their phone. This is really important data and something I wanted to highlight, because we want to really empower you to have conversations with your teen. I think too often parents are going about this as kind of, obviously wanting to protect their child, and kind of, implementing restrictions without the input of their teen and kind of, including them in that process. And that's one thing we want to be really cognizant of, is making sure that they are heard and involved in the process, because sometimes there's even little things that they are, willing to admit, like that they spend too much time on their phone. And honestly, it's a pretty surprising share of teens here, who would probably be likely to say, like, yeah, I want to try to spend less time on my phone. So that's, some buy-in you can then build off of as you're trying to implement some of those kind of developmentally appropriate guidelines. And just a little bit more about the teen perspective. So most teens also say that the benefits outweigh the harms for people of their age. So that's one of the reasons we asked you about those both sides of that coin. And again, so this could be kind of one of the crux, sort of the crux of the issues between teens and parents, is really just a differing view of those benefits and harms. And so having a conversation can really, illuminate some of those things for a family, to just sort of say, how are you thinking about this? How am I thinking about this? And let's kind of come to some agreements in the middle. And about 2/3 of teens say that their phone makes it easier for them to pursue interests, be creative. Fewer, however, think it helps them learn good social skills. I know that was one of the benefits that parents today highlighted in your responses. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind. And that could be one of the other ways to frame a conversation with your teen, is to say, like, where do you think it helps you, right? And do you think it helps you with social skills? Do you think it helps you maintain connection? And I know that's not, that's not something here that's listed, right? Is that connection and that social support. But develop healthy friendships is up there. A lot of teens seem to think that that makes those things easier. However, a lot seem to think that it makes those social skills harder. And that could be one reason to actually prioritize in-person socialization as opposed to digital. And one way to kind of, one reason to sort of balance both of those. And then this is not the most recent study, but it's a really good one that we've kind of relied on for years because it's a really helpful image here that shows that among social media users, and again, this is a larger group, so 14 to 24. This is from 2017 from a study in the UK. But what they felt in terms of the main social media platforms at that time, in terms of these different domains of life, how helpful in terms of negatives, or how helpful or unhelpful they found those platforms. So you can see across the board, sleep is really the most consistent here in terms of negatives. Many people felt that those platforms across the board, especially Facebook, at the time were impacting their sleep negatively. And if you go all the way towards the bottom, that's where things get more positive. And you can see that Instagram was especially helpful, people surmised, for their self-expression. And so was Twitter, and a little bit less so, but also Snapchat and Facebook. So take a quick look. It's a lot to digest here, but take a quick look down these lists of domains. And this is something that we really want to keep in mind because you can see, for example, where it says access to health advice, right? There are differences here between some of these platforms, and that's one of the reasons we encourage parents to look at them more specifically as opposed to just social media as a whole. We want to look at what the content is, what the platform is, and how it operates. So you can see access to health advice. People felt as a whole that Snapchat did negatively in that domain, whereas Facebook was a little bit positive. So it's helpful to kind of look at some of these differences sometimes and say, how are you using these different platforms differently?
All right, thank you, Ayal. Now kind of transitioning to the connections between social media and mental health. And I think one of the things we have seen from the differences in teen perspectives and parent perspectives that Ayal pointed out are that they're pretty different. And so I want to always tell, when I run social media groups with kids, I say, I'm not just some adult coming in here telling you what to do. So we always want to keep that in mind and pros and cons. This next stuff is going to be a little bit about the cons. So what are some mental health challenges that we see and what are the risk factors for them? So you guys put this in the poll a little bit, but for depression, anxiety, we see social comparison, right? So saying, oh, this girl looks prettier than me. I need to lose weight, right? Comparing ourselves to others and thinking that we are less than because of it. Getting negative feedback also. Trolls, people commenting saying you're ugly or this is stupid, or even cyberbullying. For substance use, we see that risky self-presentation. So posting photos of doing things or that are maybe not as appropriate for this age range, or seeing content like that, being exposed to content like that, drugs, alcohol use, promiscuity, things like that. Insomnia, we see a huge link between insomnia and frequency of use. So more screen time, many of us may know, inhibits the production of melatonin, which is the sleep hormone. And so kids who are using their screens at night, they're not going to be sleeping as much. And then addictive, quote unquote, social media use, which we'll talk more about. Emotional investment is really key to those addictive type behaviors. So not being able to stop your use because you're so emotionally invested. So, in terms of this is important to me, I care about the likes I'm getting. I care about how many people are sharing my post and my tweet. And that's when people kind of get into those more addictive behaviors. Next. Sorry to be nerdy again and pull from the research. I know this slide has a lot of info on it, but I just think this is a great explanation. If I created it, I probably would have cut down on the info, but there's a great team of researchers. Jackie Nisi is at Brown and Mitch Prinstein is at UNC, and they came together to write these papers on the differences between online interactions and peer relationships between in real life, that's IRL, which the kids will probably say is a dated term, but and kind of pulling your attention to this middle part and the right side part. So there's just all these differences that change the way that we interact, right? So for instance, the frequency or immediacy of experiences, they're on the right side. So if your friend texts you and says, "Can you FaceTime right now?" Right? And then the friend doesn't respond, maybe they'll be seen as a bad friend, right? Maybe they'll be judged for not responding right away. I've heard, stories of kids who say, "I time the amount of time it takes for my best friend to like my post. And if they don't like my post right away, they're not a good friend, right?" So it's like this pressure to be immediate and frequent and be responsive, right, at all hours of the night. But that can also be a good thing, right? If I'm struggling with depression, anxiety, I can FaceTime my friend and feel better and have a great conversation, right? Or I can, post something and have someone respond and validate me, and that's really nice, right? And that also goes with the amplification of demands. Then there's also the, new experiences and opportunities here at the bottom, right? Connecting with groups and friends that you might not have in your immediate area, right? So think of, for instance, an LGBT youth, a trans kid who lives in rural Oklahoma and they don't have any trans kids in their school, right? They can find an online community where they find social support. And that can be really, really powerful, even life-saving in some cases, right? Going back to where the arrow is, permanence, right? Things are online forever. Kid gets into Harvard. Harvard finds an old post that's inappropriate, right? And their offer is rescinded. So that's something that is really scary. Permanence, publicness, right? Cue absence is one I like to point out a lot. When we're talking through a screen, we can't see the other person's face if we're commenting, right? So teens can say some pretty nasty, nasty things. Like I had one teen, say some pretty nasty stuff online that she would never say in person, right? Because there's that kind of I can't say that word, but there's this like anonymous feature to being behind a screen. And so that's why cyberbullying can get really nasty. And so there are all these differences that just make it really, really, different than how we might interact online. That can be either a pro or a con. Next. And again, a bit more research, but we really want to look at those middle factors, right? Like, why are kids having mental health issues, and why are some kids getting depressed from social media, and why are some kids not, right? So it's not just like a blanket statement of more use equals more depression. That is a mistake. We want to look at what are the kids doing online, right? So this article, basically the middle things are just called mediators, which explains the relationship. So on the left side, we have digital media use frequency, right? Hours spent. On the right side, we have internalizing problems, which basically means anxiety, depression. And then on the middle, we have, okay, what is kind of explaining these relationships? Social comparison, negative feedback. Interestingly, this third one, I'll throw you for a loop here. This one is negatively related to anxiety and depression. So this means that those who post more risky content online are less depressed. That's interesting, right? And it basically, if you read the article, it basically says that, well, teens want to be popular, right? And they want to be liked. And sometimes when you post more risky or, dramatic content online, you get more likes, you post more pictures of yourself, right? You get more likes, you're in the popular crowd, maybe you're, drinking and going to the parties, then maybe you're happier. So it's not all one thing leads to another and simple as that. We really need to look at what are kids doing, why are they doing it, what's the outcome, and yeah, all those like little nuances that we want to see. Next. Okay. So now we're getting into true or false. Social media addiction is a real disorder. Do people think that's true or false?
And we'll just give you a moment to answer, and then we are going to discuss this quickly in terms of what the research in the field currently tells us about this question.
We have about 50% of people have responded so far. Okay, what is leading? Most of 75% are saying true.
Okay, yeah. So let's go through this. And this is one of the reasons we asked the question. So currently, social media quote unquote addiction is not really recognized in the field. However, this is a really new area of research. It's very possible that it will be recognized shortly or in the next few years. What is recognized in the literature is something called problematic media use, and that is media use that's excessively frequent and excessively interfering with a child's or a teen's daily life. In terms of addiction, however, this is a slide here that shows us that a lot of the aspects of addiction can be present for those with problematic media use. So the salience, so spending a lot of time thinking about social media, the tolerance, which is, you can think of a drug where somebody takes more and more of it, and then they need more the next time to get the same high or the same response. That can happen the same way with social media, right? Where just a little bit is no longer as reinforcing, and now I need more to kind of get that same amount of reinforcement. Mood modification, or using social media just to forget about your problems, or as like a little bit of a maladaptive coping skill, as we would call it, or an unhelpful way to cope. Some relapse, trying not to use it, but then going back to it. Withdrawal, being really stressed or upset if I'm not allowed to use my social media apps, and then conflict, as we talked about before. I use social media apps. Here's the example: so much that it has a bad effect on my schoolwork or my job. So kind of that interfering, and that's something that we'll get to in terms of how to address with teens. As it shifts to the next slide here. So some stats here about social media and mental health, kind of as a continuation. So 41% of the highest users of social media have rated their overall mental health as poor, at least in this one pretty comprehensive survey, or very poor. And that was only 23% for the lowest users. So you can see there's this discrepancy there between those that use a lot of social media or use it a lot, or those that use it less. About 4.8 hours per day was the average amount that those surveyed spent per day, and this was a survey of adolescents specifically. And about 37% said that they spend 5 or more hours. And that's a really high number. So it's something that we want to keep in mind. Even as we talk about the reasons that content and actual use and how it looks and how it kind of operates is more important than the overall amount of time spent, those extremes can still be concerning and can still have some negative consequences. So, at the extremes, we still do want to be addressing that number in terms of their overall use. 60% of the highest users of social media with low parental monitoring, so those who had parents that did not monitor as much, and weak parental relationships, weak relationships with their parental figures, also reported poor or very poor mental health. And that's a really high number. So, this is sort of highlighting the ways that parental monitoring and parental relationships are key. And again, we're going to get to this a little bit later, but we want to be balancing these things, especially in terms of monitoring, right? Obviously, we want a really strong relationship with parents, and there's no issues there. But in terms of monitoring, we want to be kind of doing a little bit of, we want to kind of strike a balance between monitoring our teen and then also allowing them some independence and kind of to build some skills in this domain. And then just continuing this same kind of statistic of those users who, again, had low parental monitoring and weak parental relationships, 22% also expressed thoughts of suicide or self-harm. So again, just highlighting the really dire mental health consequences for that group in particular. And again, with this slide, one of the things we don't want to forget is there are benefits here, but it's really important to look at overall use. And this is one of the reasons it's really key to look at an individual's use and these different factors. We never want to just kind of look at the number, like we said. If the number is way too high, it's still going to raise some red flags. But we want to also look at what's going on in their life, how they're using it, why they're using it, when, what it's interfering with, what it's not, and what are they gaining from it, etc.
All right, so the nitty gritty. What can we do to help promote digital well-being in teens? We're going to have one more poll, so bear with us. Next, true or false? looking at all those stats, learning about all this, and based on your own experience, I need to monitor everything my teen does across all social media accounts for them to stay safe. What do we think? What do you
I
guys
may
want to
I may have accidentally spoiled the answer to this one on the last slide, but
do?
what are your thoughts here?
Okay. We have about 50% in and 80% say false.
All right. Nice. That's what I like to see. So everything is a little extreme. Everything all the time is a little extreme, right? But we actually do hear that from parents a lot, right? That they monitor every type of app, they read all the text messages, everything, right? But the problem with that, did you ever lie as a teenager? I did, right? And so I think my dad is watching today, so he can attest to that. But so teenagers are going to lie. They're going to do stuff behind your back, whether you like it or not. And sometimes, if we're too over restrictive, they might lie even more, right? So we want to have that balance between monitoring and giving them their privacy, autonomy, right? Like I said, this is the time period where they're going to build autonomy and independence. I always like showing this kind of graph to parents. In psychology, we study 4 different parenting styles. This is decades and decades of research support. If you kind of read this out, hopefully you guys can guess what's our gold standard. It's this right upper quadrant here, authoritative. This balance between being kind, warm, open, responsive, and that horizontal part of demandingness and having high expectations, right? We don't want to be the friend that's here in the left, like do whatever you want, everything's cool, everything's chill. And we don't want to be the dictator, right? The authoritarian in the bottom right either. You have to do this because I said so. No screen time, during the weekdays, you can only watch 1 hour of TV, right? We kind of want to have this balance between both. Next. So having clear rules, enforcing them consistently, and be willing to give and take, negotiate, not being too punitive. We want to kind of strike that middle ground, which can be really, really difficult in the moment, right? When you find out that your teen's been doing something kind of shady, probably the immediate reaction is to go to one side. Or if they're super independent and responsible, I don't need to monitor them as much, right? So we want to keep that middle ground as much as we can. And we'll kind of show how to do that next.
Excuse me. Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to get into is we've been talking a little bit about knowing specifics about the different platforms, about content. These are some great resources to figure out how to do that. Common Sense Media is a platform that reviews movies, TV shows, apps, and really all of the above. And they've got a lot of great resources that you should explore. There is also the American Academy of Pediatrics has what they call their Center of Excellence on social media and youth mental health. And they have a glossary of all digital media platforms. So I highly recommend checking that out. And we will be able to, I think, later on to drop some of these links in the chat. But feel free to write these down as we're talking about them now to save for later. And then Instagram specifically, just because we know it's one that's very concerning and very popular for a lot of parents and teens, is puts out its own parental guide. And one of the things that you should do with each of those platforms is actually explore those guides. A lot of them these days, usually for PR reasons, have these parental guides just in terms of, ways to kind of make it safer for teens, for kids, and go through those guides. One of the things they do a good job of is detailing all of the parental sort of safety mechanisms and privacy settings that are built in. So I would encourage you to go through those, make sure that all the settings are the way that you and your teen prefer, and then use those resources to really make sense of what your teen is using and why they're using it.
Oh, is this me?
Yeah, sorry, I'll turn it back to you.
I lost track. Okay. So education, not only for yourself, but for your teenagers, right? That's why we're like, get to know the apps, because we want to know what we're talking about, right? And not assume that we know everything. So kind of just having conversations with your kids and being open, like, oh, what are the pros and cons for you? Knowing that tech companies build in features to manipulate your attention. So something like an autoplay, videos playing one after the other, that's intentional. They did that on purpose so that you continue to watch. Likes and notifications, those kind of access the same brain structures that are accessed by drugs, gambling, right? They're social rewards. They make us feel good. So that's intentional. And teen brains, like we said, we love rewards. And knowing that we have the power to change our algorithm and kind of use features to our advantage, which we'll talk about more. But how do you change your algorithm? Watch different stuff. The more stuff you watch of the same content, the algorithm will spit that back out at you. And lastly, knowing that social media is not real life. Highlight reels, people only post their best moments, right? There's lots of misinformation, which we'll talk about. There's AI, there's people using filters. So if you think a girl is prettier than you, maybe not, because she's using all these filters and makeup, right? And fake news is out there, as we've seen in the media. So really making sure kids know that this isn't the full picture, even if it feels like it is. And we'll talk more about misinformation, so these are just some like kind of crazy statistics that I love to share with kids, especially those with mental health difficulties. So in research studies that they've done, and they've kind of sorted through videos on TikTok tagged ADHD, mental health advice, autism, and they kind of have medical professionals rate, okay, is this accurate? Is this misleading? Is this inaccurate or harmful? So videos tagged ADHD, 52% of the videos were lacking scientific evidence. Videos tagged autism, 41% were inaccurate. 32% had misleading overgeneralizations, right? Things like if you, think about what you're going to order at a restaurant before you go, then you're neurodivergent, right? It's like, I do that too, right? Like I look at the menu online, right? Just these random behaviors that people are tagging as neurodivergent or autistic or something like that. In the middle, mental health advice, mental health tips, 31% were rated as inaccurate, 14% potentially damaging. What does that mean? Maybe even recommending a medication that might not work, right? Self-diagnosis is a huge thing. I will say on the other hand, so these are probably alarming, right? On the other hand, some kids do feel like they learn a lot about mental health, right? Or that their experiences are validated. So for example, if kids follow the page of a real psychologist, right, who has credentials, who has training, and who's sharing knowledge and information and resources, that could be really helpful. Or they say, oh, I saw some symptoms, maybe let's go get an evaluation and go to a doctor. And they're actually seeking professional help. That could be helpful. But when it's not helpful is when it's really misleading and leads to more harm than good. And so we'll move on to a few more strategies for you guys.
Yeah, so this is a framework, the 5 Cs. There's only 3 on the screen, but the other 2 will come next. That's put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics that we really like. And it's a way to kind of frame conversations about and considerations really about your teen specifically and looking at the individual child, their environment, and all of these different factors. So the first C is child, right? How does that make you feel is one of the questions that you can ask your teen. What did you learn from that situation? How does social media affect you personally? These are things we want you to be considering, but also having conversations with about your teen related to their media use. There could be factors individual to your child that make their needs a little bit different than all the other kids around them. And that's something to take into consideration. In terms of content, asking your teen what's worth your attention. What types of content are helpful or harmful? What can we change about your algorithm, right? In terms of, is there a type of content you don't want to see that you can mark as like, I don't really want to see this anymore? Or a way that you can kind of, scroll right past stuff that you don't want to see to make the algorithm that you're cultivating learn that that's not something you want to see. And there's also a lot of people who will actually tailor their algorithms intentionally to make sure that they are seeing positive content and stuff that they enjoy. Calm, how do you manage your emotions? What are your go-to coping skills? And how does phone use get in the way or help with some of those coping skills? One of the things that has been really big these days is different meditation apps. It could be a way that they're texting their friends when they're seeking social support, like Aiden mentioned before. So we want to be not necessarily just looking at this black or white, but really asking, like, are there ways it helps you calm down, or are there ways it doesn't? And really considering both sides of that coin. And then getting to crowding out, which is really one of the big ones here. What does it get in the way of in general? What limits or boundaries can then be set as a result? If it's getting in the way of homework or physical activity or social contact with peers, that's really important to keep in mind. And then communication. We want to, across the board, keep communication open as much as possible, even about the negatives, right? About the negatives, but also the positives. We want kids to be able to come to you and talk about these things, but we also want you to be able to go to them and have conversations about what you're seeing. So really just kind of in general, keeping open lines of communication at all times, neutral, positive, or negative is really important. You can use open-ended questions. You can model taking turns in those conversations. And next, collaborate on a family media plan, which we'll get to a little bit more specifically. And that's a resource, again, put out by the AAP and this Center of Excellence that they have, which I would highly recommend looking further into. So again, have open conversations. This is sort of breaking down that communication and collaboration. We want to limit your judgment and express curiosity, right? Just say like, hey, so tell me about that game. What kind of character is it? That game that you're always on, right? What do you like about it? Is that one that you play with friends, or is it strangers? Is it just by yourself, right? Talk about these things with them. Usually, in my experience, teens will love telling you about the things that they're interested in as long as you keep it open-ended and neutral and casual. So definitely use that to your advantage. Use reflective listening. Summarizing their responses back to them. And this is a skill that we learn as clinicians really from the beginning. For example, it sounds like it's tricky to limit your screen time sometimes. How can we help with that? Or it does seem like social media is a fun distraction when you're bored. I hear you saying that's a positive. What other activities might improve your mood, right? So using reflective listening to validate what they're saying, but then also shift it in a direction that you are intending the conversation to go. And then shifting the focus onto yourself and peers. What can I be doing better in role modeling technology use? One of the things that I always tell parents is to avoid being the parent who is telling kids not to have their phones out at the dinner table, but then is also checking a work email at the same time, right? Really hold yourself to those same rules and expectations. Asking kids, what's the cringiest thing you've seen other kids do online? Asking about what they don't like about some of their peers' behaviors around media use, and having some of those conversations more in depth. In terms of creating a family media plan, some of the different considerations we want to include, tech-free zones are a really helpful thing. So again, I mentioned the dinner table. That's an area that a lot of families use as a kind of no screen zone. For a lot of families, it's also the bedroom, and there's a lot of research to suggest that that's a helpful way to go about things. In terms of not having screens in the bedroom, or having limited screens in the bedroom, right? Maybe just a music player or an e-reader, but not the video game console, not the TV screen. Different ways to kind of do this, but that are really helpful. And tech-free times. So it could be first thing in the morning. It could be at dinner time again. Could be when you're on the way or when you're driving to school, because knowing that that's going to be a fight, for your child once it's time to put it down and get out of the car. Whatever it is related to your child specifically, we want to kind of think about these aspects. And then device curfews. Again, the impact of sleep cannot be understated, especially for adolescents. It is so, so crucial to be getting enough sleep, and adolescents need more than the average adult or child, typically. So we want to make sure that their sleep is prioritized, and having device curfews is really crucial. So I think the recommendation is at least an hour before bed, really just putting away all screens and shifting your activities to something else, whether that's reading, coloring, a board game, whatever that's going to be whatever that's going to look like that works for your family. Some families have also had a lot of success keeping their screens really as a family in a public hallway or something like that, to make sure that everybody's following that same expectation about no screens after a certain hour. In terms of social media safety, we want to be discussing the risks of interacting with strangers online, Practice identifying quote unquote sketchy users, those who, don't seem real or seem like they're asking for too much. Especially about personal information. We want to be teaching our adolescents these skills. Again, utilize those privacy settings. They're there. And so we want to make sure that you're using them. For example, a lot of parents don't know, usually it's more common these days, but at first a lot of parents didn't know that Instagram could be public or it could be a private profile, depending on your settings. So, really knowing the different ways to go about those different platforms and use the WWGS rule. This is one that we like. What would grandma or Harvard say, right? Thinking about like, is this content something that I want staying online, knowing about the permanency that some of these platforms have built in. Don't share personal information. A lot of kids kind of know this these days, but some really struggle with it. So we want to make sure that they're aware, not to share their home address, their location. Sometimes it's even like what school they go to if they're just chatting with a peer. Different things like that can be used to to do some nefarious things. We want to teach kids to be careful about those. Watch out for scams, right? People who are Venmo, people posing as friends who don't really seem like they are, or like, oh, why did this person get a new account all of a sudden? Why aren't they messaging me from their other account that I know more readily? Block or report inappropriate content, including cyberbullying. So this is one thing that we want to reinforce for kids, is that they do have some control over their platforms and their media use and their algorithms. So really taking that to their advantage.
And maybe for the sake of time, we just skip the next slide.
Sure.
Or just we could leave it up for a minute, but these are some tips on cyberbullying. And cyberbullying.org is a great resource for that. And then we can go to the next one. All right, and we'll skip this one also, actually. Great. And if you guys could put your questions in the chat, that would be great because we're going to do Q&A in a few minutes. And I also want to point out, just adding on to the safety piece, it can be trickier than just, location, right? Or sharing your school name. We also want to think about like, oh, our kids posting like a picture on vacation, right? With the name of the hotel in the back that they didn't notice, or there's something called geotagging, or sharing your location on Snapchat via a map. So there's all these like nuances to it that we want to keep an eye on. This is just about breaking cycles. We talked about how likes and notifications affect the reward systems in the brain. And so this is kind of an example of a cycle. So we use social media, we see likes, our dopamine increases, we get that dopamine hit, right? We feel happy, but it's not sustainable. Dopamine eventually decreases, then we want to get on it again. So a strategy for this, Next slide. Awesome. Is we want to break those cycles. So let's use offline dopamine hits, right? This is super important to encourage kids to not only, be safe and maximize their time online, but also to maximize their time offline. And we know that the human brain loves things that are physically active, social, sunshine, those give us dopamine, right? So exercise, getting outside, planning family game night, doing a spa day. I know no teens don't want to hang out with their parents, but trust me, it's helpful. And if you try to plan fun activities that they actually want to do also, like, going to Sephora and getting makeup, that could be really fun. Or getting pizza, getting takeout, letting them choose what to get for dinner. Those are really, really powerful. Next. Also using tech to our advantage, right? Turning off that autoplay feature, using do not disturb, DND. I've heard a lot of kids say, when I'm in class, I just put do not disturb on and then I don't see all the notifications. So my brain can't get that dopamine hit, right? So just shutting off all those notifications, setting time limits. I think in the apps, there are time limits sometimes, or even setting a loud alarm, right? Okay, this is bedtime. This is when I'm going to turn my phone off. Next. And also using apps that support focus and mental health. There's a cute one called Forest that basically it shows a picture of a tree growing. And if you exit out of the app, your tree will die. So like for kids with ADHD or focus concentration difficulties, it's like a game, right? And some kids might like that. Like, oh, I want to protect my tree. I don't want it to die. And that's a physical thing that will help them not touch the phone. And it's actually a good cause. It contributes to charity and planting trees, which is great. Next. All right, and then there's all these great apps for mindfulness, meditation, even mental health. MindShift helps with cognitive behavioral therapy. So actually teaching some of these kids or some of these skills to help with anxiety. Like it has some breathing techniques in there, right? Some meditations. Calm Harm, this is a specific app for teens who struggle with self-harm, cutting, suicidality. It has evidence-based resources in it. So when a teen is feeling distressed, they can open up the app and they can find a coping skill, right? This can be potentially life-saving. So use the apps that are good and promote good mental health. These are really, really great resources. Next. So what did we learn today? We learned a lot of things. Teens are special. We love them, but they drive us crazy, right? They're different than us. They're different than adults. They're both pros and cons to social media. So the next time someone asks you if social media is bad for mental health, say it's complicated, right? That's what we've learned today. We want to minimize those risks and maximize any of those benefits. Educate, communicate, collaborate, and we're all human. So if your kid uses screen time for 8 hours a day, you're doing your best. That's okay sometimes. You know, if you notice you're on your phone a lot, that's okay sometimes too. We just want to kind of use some of these strategies and get better every day. Next to the resources, we have a lot of great resources here. Remember some of these names, screenshot this. We have also links on the next slide. If we go next, and I'll put some of these links in the chats just so that we have them, and now we can go to Q&A. So you guys can copy and paste those links if you would like. Oh, and I also want to take a minute to promote our Teens and Screens group. We are running a social media therapy group where we teach some of the same content to the teens themselves. We might actually have a parent session in there too, but we teach some of these skills and strategies and give a safe space to teenagers to talk about their own experiences. We'll be running that end of this month and March. So please reach out to us if you're interested in signing your kids up for that. We would love to have you all be personally running it with a co-leader. So that would be great. Madison, if you wouldn't mind sharing the contact, or I guess, oh, there's a QR code there. And we have discounts for that too. So if you guys could go to that website, that would be great. And Madison, can you share the link to that in the
Yeah,
or like
so
phone number or email?
everybody who is attending today's webinar will receive an email after we log out to receive a link to these and as well as the discount. So no worries there. You don't need to scramble to jot it down or to scan it. We will send you an email after the webinar ends.
Great, thanks.
Of
And I
course.
see some questions. We can go to those. One is, are teens comparing their use to other teens in those polls? So a lot of the research we presented was self-report. So teens just basically reporting on their own use. And then what is considered to be too much based on research findings and negative impact. So for that question, I've seen some research that says above 3 hours of use per day comes with more risks. Sometimes it's 5 hours, but I also want to mention, again, we want to think about the specific behaviors, not just frequency. But once we get to that like 5 or more, that's when we're seeing more negative impacts. Does boundary setting work? And then tricky to put limits on the phone. Oh, So I can answer this one: boundary setting work with social media use, and how can this be effectively adopted without being tagged authoritarian? That's a great question. So again, we want to work with the teens and say what can work for you, right? And I see another question about schoolwork. So when do they need to have access to their laptop versus their phone? What types of assignments do they have on their phone, right? And what boundaries are going to work for you? Like, is it going to be a few hours per night? Is it going to be, we have dinner time and no screens? And really collaborate to find a plan that's going to work best for you and your family. And that's what I would say. Ayal, did you have additional thoughts on that?
No, yeah, I think that's the perfect answer. And I think, at some point it's kind of like you're steering the ship, but we want their input on kind of what it's going to look like specifically. So, even if you can kind of say like, look, we're going to need to put some restriction on your use and kind of, implement some guidelines. Let's talk about kind of what would work best for you, given that that's going to be our goal. Kind of, guiding them to that conversation, but at the same time, you are gonna want to do what's best for them, and ultimately you are the caregiver involved. So
Yeah.
kind of guiding them, but using their input and making it a conversation.
Yeah. And really, some kids like have access to therapy resources on their phone. So if they're in distress and you take their phone away, that's not going to be helpful, right? So really making the decisions along with your teens, with all of this knowledge in your pocket.
All right. Well, thank you both, Aiden and Ayal, for presenting such a needed topic and for sharing some about our social group opportunity that we have. And thank you everyone for attending. Unfortunately, this is time. We have jotted down your questions and we will send them on to Ayal and Aiden for some responses. We'll be sharing those responses through our social media platforms. They are linked here on the screen. They should be posted within the next week or so. If you have any questions after the webinar ends, feel free to email professionaldevelopment@manhattanpsychologygroup.com and I will get these questions over to them. All right.
Madison,
Thank
would
you.
it be okay to answer these two or?
Um, can we end the recording and then we can answer
Sure,
them?
sure.
Okay, perfect. Um, Overall, we hope everyone has enjoyed today's webinar and we hope you can
Thank
join
you
us
guys.
next week for our webinar on Tuesday on teen gender identity and sexual orientation.